looked at this last week about singlehood, but we're going to look at it again because even as he speaks about singlehood, he does it by affirming marriage. We had said that last week, right? We're in the series of Theology of Family, so for those guests who are joining us, this is where we are, and you could catch up on the website, okay? Everything is kind of interconnected, so it is important for us to, even those people who heard this message, to be able to go back, and so you could understand what is being said today. But in any case, we're going to read from verse 1 to 5 and look at marriage. Now for the matters you wrote about, it is good for a man not to marry. But since there is so much immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife's body does not belong to her alone, but also to her husband. In the same way, the husband's body does not belong to him alone, but also to his wife. Do not deprive each other except by mutual consent and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Then come together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. This is the word of our Lord. Thanks be to God. Our disclosure, we're going to talk about sex. Okay. One is because this text is about sex. And I think it is not right for us to shush the Bible simply for our own sake of propriety. The text talks about sex, so let us listen. And I know there might be young people here, or maybe parents with children, and that's a little bit uncomfortable. But I do believe it's important that we do talk about sex, actually right here from the pulpit, from the Bible. Because it's not like people are not getting teachings about sex outside of this place. In other words, when you go out, step out into the world, all you hear about is sex. And they constantly bombard you. The world tries to indoctrinate us about their beliefs and assumptions about sex. It's everywhere, right? From commercials, from billboards, to internet, to friends, school, teachers. And with all that, the tsunami of voices that teaches us about sex and what it is, and a lot of it really lies, unfounded, I think it's very important that we see sex in the light of God who created it. Right? We're going to combat that. And so not even just young people, even as adults, even if we have reflected about sex from the biblical passage, I think it's important for us to hear it repeatedly. I think the best advice that I got about how to teach sex to the kids is this: don't just have the talk, have the talks. So every day I'm talking to Ian. I'm just, not yet. Right? He's still not old enough, he's 6 years old, but he does ask occasionally, and at that point I just sit down and I do speak to his level. And I really believe, I can't assume that if I had that one talk, the uncomfortable talk, checked out of the parents' to-do list, I'm done, I don't have to ever talk about the birds and the bees again, then I'm being irresponsible. So in the same sense, the text is here, we're talking about marriage, and for Paul, when he talks about marriage, he talks about sex. And so here we are, and so we're having another talk, a conversation actually. And you'll see that after this sermon, you're going to go to your Sunday connections, and you're going to have reflection questions, and it's going to ask about sex, and it's going to be a little bit uncomfortable, but that's okay. Again, isn't it better to speak about that in here, in this community, in the light, in the worship of God who created, than out there where sex is demeaned and abused and misused? So everybody's okay with that? Yeah? Okay. All right, so before we do that, let's have time of stillness. Let us be still. Okay. No instructions here, just for a minute. Take deep breaths. And just listen to the presence of God. Let us open our eyes. Why get married? Why marry? And that's what people are asking nowadays. Less people are getting married, more people are getting divorced. Compared to 1960, the divorce rate is 2 times higher. Why get married? Why risk that? In 1970, about 78% of the children were born to married parents. Today, 50%. Why get married? In 1960, about 72% adults were married. Today, less than that, less than 50. Why get married? Even widowers and divorcees are asking that. After have going through that marriage and struggles, now that it's ended, painful as it is, they say, why get married? Why get remarried? So John Dryden has this poem. He says here, here lies my wife, here let her lie. She is at rest, and so am I. And so the question is, why do we get married? We frown upon singlehood, but we fear marriage. And so our society today, a lot of young people, have tried to come up with a compromise, a way to try to answer this question, why marry? And they do it by not getting married, but trying to live a married life in one sense. They have different names for it, right? Seriously monogamous relationship, or cohabitation is one thing. In 1960, there was no such thing as cohabitation. Now, more than half of the people who eventually get married begin as cohabitation. Does it work? Does cohabitation, is it a solution to that question? Does it help us to deal with that question? Meg Jay, she's a clinical psychologist, and she says this: cohabitation, right, leads to less satisfied marriage and to more divorce, especially if it comes out of without any type of commitment, clear commitment like engagement. That's what she says. And you would think that this comes out of a Christian publication, but actually it was an article in New York Times. So here's a totally secular article from a professional saying cohabitation doesn't work as it is advertised. So why get married? Now, Paul here asks, well, the Corinthian church asked Paul the same question. So the very first verse is actually not Paul's words. It's the Corinthian church words. He was just quoting it. They say, it is good for a man not to marry. It's much better not to get married. Now, remember what we learned last week? The perspective that the Corinthian church comes to this question is very different. For them, they believe marriage is not good because physical appetites, anything that has to do with the body is not good. And so they want to avoid it, right? And so from that perspective, they ask the question. And Paul answers, no, actually marriage is good because actually sex is good. And now the perspective, the question comes from a different angle, but the answer that Paul gives is actually is a good answer for us too, because the fundamental of it is still legit from wherever angle that you look at. Right? And so Paul's answer is very simple. Right? Sex in itself is not sinful, but you still have sexual urges, right? You have sexual urges. So how can you have that, control that, so it doesn't become sin? Right? And here again, the Corinthian church and a lot of the early church fathers, they had different answers to that. Right? Like Jerome, he was an early church father. He's the one who wrote the Latin Vulgate, and that became the official Catholic Bible. He struggled with sexual urges, and he felt that sexual urges were sinful, and so he had to do something about it. And even his own admission, he says that no matter how he tried to beat his body, a monastic life and all that, he still had the nude dancers that he saw in Rome dancing around his head. And so, what can I do? And so, maybe the college students might know this. He said the way to control his sexual urges is to commit himself to study, right? And so that's one way to control his sexual urges. And he tried, and he picked up a new language, Hebrew language, but that didn't help him. And so the bishop at that time in Rome said, you know what you should do? Trying to help him, giving a bigger project. He's smart. He said, write the Bible. And he said, okay, I'll do that. I'll write the Bible. And he got some help. There was Marcella, who was a woman who was committed to not getting married, but rich, so she kind of financed it. So there was Marcella, and there was Jerome, and there was another lady named Paula, All three of them, brilliant scholars, working together to write the Bible, translate the Bible from the Greek and Hebrew to the Latin, and they all did it under one home. Kind of scandalous, right? Right? 3 single scholars in the same home. Now, how are they able to overcome sexual urges? One is, of course, they commit themselves to the work. But like I said, that doesn't really help. I mean, it doesn't fully work. The other thing that they did was, all three of them vowed to never take another bath. That might work. Right? If you want to fight your sexual urges, don't take bath. That might work. Right? But Paul's answer is not that. Right? Okay, sex, if it's outside, if it's uncontrolled, it's sinful, how to fight the urges, don't take a bath. Thankfully, Paul's answer is not that. Paul's answer is this: get married. In other words, why get married? Because you have sexual urges. You get married to have sex. Now, people might say, man, that's a very low view of marriage. Is that all it is? It's not all it is. But it's definitely the essence of marriage, especially as Paul speaks to us. But at first, it might sound to us like a low view of marriage, but it's not. To put sex into marriage, what Paul is doing is actually, he's honoring sex. He's actually saying there's an essence to sexuality that you miss out when it's outside of marriage. But when you bring it in, you could see it more clearly. And so it helps us to see sex better, but in that way, it also helps us to see the heart of marriage better. Okay. So with that in mind, what exactly does marriage mean? What does marriage tell us about sex? So today, it's going to be a little bit about marriage, but also, as you can tell, it's going to be a theology about sex. The first thing it tells us, sex within marriage, is this: sex is fidelity. Sex is commitment. Here again, we go up against truths in the world that's the very opposite. And the world says that sex is pleasure, is experience, and it can be had without commitment. You can separate the commitment and all that from the act and the experience of sex. And the part of the way it does is it commodifies it. In our world, in capitalism, sex is sold. Everything is sold through sex. And so when they bring sex together to objects that they sell, what happens naturally is those two categories kind of merge together and get confused. So when you start selling beer with sex, right, drinks, Sprite with sex, cars with sex, then what happens is sex becomes like a drink or a beer or a car. It is something that you could purchase, you could buy. It is something experience that you could buy, like a movie theater experience. You could buy it and then leave without having any implications to your life or relationship. And this is so prevalent that we don't even know that we buy it. And so when you hear that sex is inherently about commitment, it's like, are you making it up? Is it? D.H. Lawrence, he was an English novelist and a writer. He says this. He says, fidelity is a essence of the complex that we call sex. In a real sex, the passion for fidelity is inherent. So this is D.H. Lawrence, a writer, and not just even a Christian writer, but he recognizes that in real sex, there's this drive and urge to commit. Now, where do we see this? There are many different ways and levels in which we see this. One thing is this: when man and a woman, when they have sex, that potentially leads to the creation of a child. And there you already have, one says, a physical act and a physical embodiment of what happens when a man and a woman comes together. There you have half of the genes of the woman and half of the genes of the man. They come together, and you have this one new human being. And those two genes cannot be spliced. It cannot be split. In a sexual act, it leads to a creation of one being that cannot be separated. So you know that creation account where God says that when a man and woman, they come together and the two become one. And so in that sexual union, there's already inherently a commitment, a fidelity to it. It also is referring to not just the body of the man and the woman, but to the child. Child himself kind of physically shows, sex is not to be taken lightly. Here again, the modern culture keeps us at a distance, separates us from this because of birth control and all that stuff. Okay? Now, I'm not stating any sexual ethic commitments about the birth control usage itself, but that itself, that you could separate the procreation from sexuality with drugs, it also makes us to distance the connection psychologically. But that potentially is always there. Every sexual activity has potential for procreativity. And that means that there's always a commitment. So there's that physical embodiment of the commitment. But did you know that there's another witness about to the belief that sexuality leads to fidelity? It's actually biochemistry. A lot of researchers today have shown that biochemically, when a man and woman have sex, they have this different things, right? They have endorphins coming out, and that makes them feel good. But they have a hormone called oxytocin. And this oxytocin is called cuddle hormones. Because what it does is it creates a sense where our boundaries begin to dissolve. So there's no sense of separation between you and me. And so when there's a high level of oxytocin, the person begins to feel like he is one with the other, the sexual partner. And it goes beyond even one with the friends, one with the community, one with the world. And so even like transcendental meditation, Buddhist monks, all people who has a high ability to meditate, when they meditate and they're able to get that sense of oneness, there's a spike in oxytocin. And so what they found out, the research found out, is that when man and woman have sex, naturally the oxytocin comes out, and there's a sense that the two belong together as one. And out of that comes a sense of commitment, because it's no longer you and me separate, but you are me and I am you. And so we're united. Even in the biochemical level, sexuality is commitment. D.H. Lawrence was right. Fidelity is part of the whole complex of sex. And God was right. The Bible is right. Sexuality leads to commitment. And so, then where's the best way that you can practice this? Marriage. Because marriage creates a parameter where it's a very, very clear, very public covenant that the two are one for life. Sex is already saying that. Marriage allows that to be expressed and to make a public statement. And so that's where we see the first point, that marriage, the reason why sex needs to belong to marriage is because the marriage allows the first inherent statement of sexuality, that sexuality is about commitment. And the second thing is this. Here Paul speaking about again too, it's also in sex where sex as vulnerability is also spelled out. You know what's interesting about this talk about sex here in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 is that Paul uses the language of power to talk about sex. And here again, in our modern world where we are more about self-fulfillment, self-actualization, then this talk about sex with power language and power metaphors kind of takes us back. And what does Paul mean? And it's hard for us to accept. When Paul says here, right, verse 3, the husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The word duty is actually, the first meaning of it is debt, a financial debt. In other words, the man or the woman, right, in both ways, if you're in financial debt, that means you are under that person's authority. And especially back in those ancient times, to be under financial debt means that literally you were going to become a slave if you cannot pay it off, and most of the time that's what happened. And so that concept indenture slavery comes out, and many slaves were indentured slaves. In other words, they just couldn't pay it off, they were in debt, and they finally become slaves. And so here, Paul talks about their duty to each other as this financial debt to each other. In fact, in Romans chapter 13, Paul talks about this debt as a tax. So here is Paul talking about marriage in the words of financial debt and tax. It's what you owe to each other, like a tax. Does that kind of excite you? Right? Is this right? Is it right for Paul to speak about love and marriage in financial debt and tax? And then he goes on and says the wife's body does not belong to her alone, but also to her husband. The same way the husband's body does not belong. And there he's talking about authority. And what he's saying is the woman doesn't have power over her body, and the man doesn't have power over her. In other words, they are powerless. You lose power completely. So now here's Paul talking about love as debt and tax, and love as becoming powerless, losing all control and authority. Are you comfortable with that? You know, we say marriage is about self-fulfillment, where I'll get a fuller sense of experience, and I'll become a more whole being, and I'll be empowered to do more in my career. We talk about that, and here it is about marriage in terms of sexuality, talking about debt, tax, vulnerability, and powerlessness. Is sex then about power? The transference of power? Well, actually, it is. Right? Michel Foucault is a French thinker, and he wrote a book called History of Sexuality. And in that book, basically, what he's saying is that, as one commentator quotes, it basically says that sex is this dense point in which the relations of power is transferred. In other words, in every sexual act, there's always a sense of power, and who has the power, and who will use the power. And that is why when you look at sexuality, sexuality is a place where the most abuse of power happens. The ugliest picture of the abuse of a power is obviously pedophilia, when an adult controls and abuses the body of a kid. And there, you do the study of those, pedophilias and what leads to them. It's not so much about just the pleasure or the physical aspect, but it's that rush that they get from the power to control another body. Now that's the illegal, the most sinful, ugly picture of that. But that happens in many different areas. Right? A man goes to a prostitute, not so much to fulfill his sexual fantasies, but because he had paid for that body for an hour, and for an hour he could do whatever he wants. There's that need for power and control. Porn. Porn is never about mutual sex. Porn is always about control, isn't it? About a man controlling a woman, about a man having his way. And that's what drives many people, the sense that absolute power. Sexuality is inherently a power relationship. And in it, our natural temptation and tendency is to use it to abuse, use it to control the other. So whether we're giving sex or withholding sex, we do it to make ourselves more powerful, to have ourselves control the other person. You guys are familiar with the Lysistra play, right? It's a fun play. It's a funny play. In Greek play, and in the Greek play, it's about the Peloponnesian War, and all the Greek women, they get together, and they're just tired of these men fighting and killing each other, and so they said, let's go on a sex strike, let's withhold sex from our husbands, so then we'll force them to make peace. And it's a play, it's not a historical play, but actually, did you know that in 2011, actually, in Philippines, this is reported by UN agency, refugee agency, in 2011, there was an island where there was civil war from 1970, and in that small island, the small village, and the women, they got together and they agreed that let's withhold sex from the man, and actually all the men stopped fighting. It really worked. Well, there's maybe a good usage of power in sex, but often we abuse it. Now here it is. Even with the marriage, we tend to do that. Whether it be we withhold it, or we try to enforce it or force it. And so Paul here is saying, in marriage, right, the most beautiful sex is where you can actually give your power away to the other. And the other person can give his or her power over to you. When there's mutual, total submission of authority and power. where you no longer have any say to your body. That's a risk. And now I know like men like this passage because it says, oh, the woman has no power over the body, so the husband can go and say, woman, I need you tonight. And, right? But it's a very subversive, meaning Paul against the culture of these times. He doesn't just talk about the woman's losing authority over his body, but did you catch it? He talks about the men not having authority over his body. And actually, which does he talk about first, the men losing power or the woman losing power? The order is very purposeful. It's the men. Right? The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife. He talks about the men's debt to the woman first, before he talks about the woman's debt to the man. And in that time where actually the order was the man owned the woman and the woman owned, he kind of reversed all that and it says in the Christian marriage, right, which is about sex, it is about sex where you continually give yourself completely, and it's both mutual, submission of each other. So then, if marriage is for sex, right, then it allows us to see, again, what's inherently in the sex. That it is about commitment, fidelity, and it's about losing power and vulnerability. Then it also shows us, actually, the key to happy marriage. Is everybody following? So if the purpose of marriage, the main purpose, not all of it, is the main purpose of marriage is sex, because it is where sex, in its the way God created it to be, in its fullest sense, can come out. In that commitment, you have the fidelity and the vulnerability. It also means that the key to having a happy marriage is actually having frequent sex. Okay? Now, there's a lot of things in marriage that you need to work on. Okay, and there's a lot of books about like 5 languages of love and love and respect, and all those are good books, and we need to study on that. But at the heart of marriage is, here again, maybe we don't come up, is it about sex? That's what makes you and that other person a man and a woman, husband and wife. That's what makes that relationship different and unique from all the other relationships. It's not your friendships. It's not that you guys are living together. That doesn't make you a man and a woman, because you could have all that type of relationship outside of the marriage, right? You could be friends with other people, and that's okay. Living together, you could do that with roommates, and that's okay. Even nowadays, there are settings where you have roommates with a sexual relationship, and you could do that. But what makes the man and the woman, that marriage is that man and that woman has a sexual relationship uniquely, just between those two. That's what makes a marriage a marriage. Right? You could always have, that's why, when Jesus Christ, when they come to him and they ask him, are there any reasons for adultery? And Jesus says the only reason for adultery is, only reason for divorce is adultery. It's not, you can't divorce because that person is not a good friend, that person is not a good listener, that person is not a good roommate because he never picks up after his socks. It's been 10 years and it's still driving me crazy. Those are not all reasons for divorce, although the socks comes very close. But those are not good reasons. The only reason for divorce is adultery, because sex is the essence of marriage. And you have betrayed it when you commit adultery. And so if at that point the person who's the victim divorces, God is not going to hold that against that person. Because the person who perpetrated, who sinned, has already compromised and betrayed marriage. So the essence of marriage is sex. And so the key to having a happy marriage is to have frequent sex, right? I remember before I got married, my mother came to me and she was like, son, I want to tell you about how to be happy in marriage. And she goes, you see, your dad and I, we have frequent sex. And at that point, actually, I just kind of ran out of the room. I didn't want to hear anything more. Right? But it's true. And it's actually biblical. Isn't it? Paul could spiritualize the talk about marriage, but he hits the heart of marriage by talking about it through sexuality. And sexuality, because sexuality is best, spelled out in marriage, it tells us that sexuality is about commitment and about vulnerability, about giving yourself completely to the other person. And so the key to a happy marriage is to have regular sexual relationship. That makes you, right, the other person, a man and a woman. Now then this goes beyond it, doesn't it? Right? See, if the heart of marriage is sexuality, and if that's where you guys really give yourself, what happens is that sexual loving, that sexual commitment and sexual giving, it always naturally spills out from the bedroom into every other room in your house. It means that everything that you do in the kitchen, everything that you do in your children's room, and you teach, all of that kind of flows out of and kind of goes back into your sexual love for each other. That kind of giving that when you do in the act of sex, and again, think about the act of sex, it is a total vulnerability, giving your body to the other person. When you're doing that in a committed relationship on a regular basis, you cannot but help give yourself in other areas of your life. You are more than happy to make the sacrifices. And so there's one lady who says, I find my man most sexy when he has an apron on, right? And that basically means, again, the whole relationship now is about that. It's about sacrifice and giving, because it's already happening in that one place that's the privacy of their relationship, in the bed. Why get married? Because God created sex. But God created sex so it is about commitment and about vulnerability. And the best place where that happens is marriage. And when we practice that in marriage, when we receive the full blessing of God, then it all flows to every other parts of that relationship. Now this is the third and the final point. Sex as a commitment. Sex as a vulnerability. Those two aspects actually reveal God's love for us. In short, what I'm saying is actually sex reveals God. Again, this might be, whoa, Pastor Sam, you're taking way too far. Sex is, again, physical, sinful. No. We need to take that away from the world and stop buying the lies of the world. No. Sex in marriage is beautiful. It's about commitment and about giving. And in that way, it points to God's love. And it's not just me who's saying this. Tim Keller, he's a very famous pastor in New York Redeemer Church, and he wrote a book called The Meaning of Marriage, a very good book. And over there, he says this line, very simply, he says, sex between man and woman points us to the love of God, of the joyous, giving, and pleasurable love that God has within His triune self. Did you catch that? He's very clearly, and I love him for his honesty, because he goes to the Bible and says, sex between man and woman points to God's love within Himself, joyful, giving, and pleasurable. And that is why, actually, Paul talks about the love of the man and woman and compares that to the love of Christ for the church. And we know this passage all. Okay? Now, we're going to go to that passage, if everybody... Well, actually, you know what? Listen. Let's listen. When we listen to this passage, we usually kind of take out the sexuality outside of the man and woman relationship. And for some reason, we make it platonic. It's about this kind of love means just, I love you. Respect means honoring the man's and work. But it's more than that. Love and respect within this sexual relationship that a man and woman has. I think if you hear it like that, you'll hear it a little bit differently. Ephesians chapter 5. Okay, and you could just listen to it. Okay. Verse 21, okay, Paul says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. So you already have that language of submission, of again, the giving yourself. You don't have authority over your body. You have to give it over to the other person. Wives, submit to your husband as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, His body, of which He is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave Himself up for her, to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to Himself as a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. In the same way, husbands are to love their wives as their own bodies. Here again, the body comes out. The physicality of the relationship. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated his own body, but he feeds and cares for it just as Christ does the church. For we are members of his body. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So now Paul goes back again to creation. What happens? God created man and woman, different sex, to come together in sexuality, become a man and woman in marriage. And this is a profound mystery. The sexuality, for sure, but I am talking about Christ and the church. See, there is a mystery of sexuality, all the things that we talk about, commitment, fidelity, vulnerability, but that also points to greater mystery of how Christ loves us, of how God in Christ loves us. Right? So actually, Andrew Ogilvy, he's a Catholic theologian and a novelist. He says this, the wiles between a man and a woman, that points to the way God calls us, wins us over. It is. It is the way that God loved us in Jesus Christ. Just as a man and a woman must commit and give their body to each other, that's what Christ did. Christ committed himself to us completely. Even though we betrayed him, we said, no, we don't want you, we want to have our own life, yet Christ came down to this earth and committed himself to us to death, even life after death. And giving your body over and becoming powerless, the omnipotent, powerful God became powerless. He said to us, you have authority over my body. He gave it to humanity. And what did humanity do? We abused it, as we tend to do. We slapped it, we hit it, we nailed it, we ripped it, and we threw it away like a rag. All because Christ loved us. Sexuality is powerful, and that's why we can't let the world have it. And that's why every couple, every marriage, every family, every time you love each other fully, committed, with all vulnerability, you are restoring the world. You're restoring the way God intended sex to be. And as powerful and as beautiful as this, and that's our purpose in marriage, and you do it, that cannot compare to the way God loves us. The way, in the greatest exercise you might have with your husband and wife, when you're totally giving and you are one with that person, that's just a hint of the way in which God loves us and gave himself up for us, giving his body and becoming powerless. Simone Weil, she was precocious. She knew Greek at the age of 12. Very smart. She wanted to learn all religions. She read Bhagavad Gita, right, which is a Bible from Hinduism. And to read that, she studied Sanskrit. She was a Jewish agnostic. But one day in 1938, she had an experience. She was reading this poem by George Herbert. It was entitled Love 3. George wrote a poem speaking about Christ's love for him in this romantic, almost erotic language. And when she finished that poem, something happened in her. She wrote in her own journal, quote, that Christ possessed her. And when Christ possessed me, in my life of suffering, I felt a loving presence, similar to what you might see in the smile of the beloved's face. For her, she experienced Christ's love expressed in a love poetry. She experienced it as Christ who comes to her in this full, again, sexual type of love where it's totally giving, totally committed. And that changed her life. Albert Camus, the atheist, existentialist, she said of Simone Weil, the only great soul of our time. And she was. The way she sacrificed herself. Because she was a woman in love. She knew how much God loved her. Let's pray.